We're glad you're with us today to discuss Holy Troublemakers and Unconventional Saints by Daneen Akers. On the Spectrum website, there was an illustration of Daneen's next book, Dear Mama God, that we look forward to discussing with her once it is complete. Today, we're looking at this book, Holy Troublemakers and Unconventional Saints, and too. And we're delighted that Daneen is with us for this conversation. Daneen's a born storyteller, whether it's in the classroom, making a film like Seventh Day Adventists, or writing this book, or just having a casual conversation. She's always got great things to share. Welcome, Daneen.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
Alexander Carpenter is taking a break from life in the U.S. He's headed south to Mexico, but he's with us today. Welcome, Alexander.
It's great to be here talking about Daneen's book with all of you, and I'm looking forward to hearing her thoughts on all things unconventional and saintly.
Carmen Lau, Adventist Forum Board Chair and regular host of our book conversation, is here. I think she has lots of questions to ask Daneen, so she told me to moderate today. Welcome, Carmen.
Hi, thanks. Well, I'm wondering if we could take this title and rename our book group into Holy Troublemakers and Unconventional Saints. As I'm thinking, that might be very fitting for us, but I look forward to this with all of you.
Artist and children book author Sharon Fujimoto Johnson joins our panel today. She's no stranger to Spectrum readers. Her design for the journal set the tone for its pages for 25 years. So welcome, Sharon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Nancy LaCourte, another children's book author who also taught English at UC before becoming the academic dean there. Now she's retired and she hosts the PUC Choir Room Zoom Sabbath School. She gardens, volunteers, and tells great jokes. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you. And I don't ever expect to be saintly, but I'm happy to make trouble whenever I can. So I will join that book club.
Okay. Well, to get us started, in case you have not read this with your child at bedtime lately, Holy Troublemakers and Unconventional Saints brings together short biographical sketches of 36 individuals, 24 women and 12 men. 7 of them are historical figures like Florence Nightingale. 4 are more recent figures like Mr. Rogers and Mary Oliver, who have passed away. But the rest of the people are still living. And I want to hear about the how you handled talking with these living saints. But over half of them are pastors or rabbis or imams. The world religions are all covered, but Christians heavily outnumber the others. 11 are international and the rest are American. Each story is colorfully illustrated with a portrait of the saint. And since a different artist was chosen to illustrate each story, the portraits are as different as the saints. This is a book for children, so there is a glossary in the back to explain terms like indigenous, mindfulness, sexual orientation. The book begins with a story about the historical figure Alice Paul, who helped women to get the vote in America. It ends with the story of Reverend Will Gaffney, a womanist theologian who teaches the importance of recognizing the women in the Bible. She's quoted as saying, "I believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but I also believe in the God of Hagar, Sarah, Ketcha, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah." So you can see we do have a lively group of people to be talking about. And get into questions now from our panel, and then about 2:40, we'll open it up for our people who are joining us to also ask questions. Daneen, just looking at this beautiful book, it's obvious that the book itself has an incredible story of its own, in addition to the many wonderful stories that it contains. So let me begin by asking you about your writing process. What came after the initial spark of inspiration? How did you choose who to include in your saints? I know for a Catholic saint, you have to have done a miracle. Did all of these saints have to have some certain kind of a characteristic? Did you have a grid that you were looking at? Was there a ratio that you wanted between the living and the dead? Tell us about that process, please.
Yes, happily. So I do agree that Spectrum is a group of holy troublemakers for sure, and have appreciated that. I definitely have had to explain to a few parents, by the way, I do mean holy trouble in a slightly different way than just troublemaking. It's about people who have stood up for love and justice. And actually my main inspiration to start with was Bayard Rustin. This is his portrait here. So Bayard is somebody we should all know about. He was a civil rights leader, an incredible strategist for nonviolent movements. He was a key advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King. He organized the March on Washington, but we don't know about him often, although we're hearing about him a little bit more these days, but he was also gay at a time when that was just an incredible liability. So he was really forced to be in the background. And his ethic of holy troublemaking, he called it angelic troublemaking, is really what inspired the book. So I tried to find people who matched that. In some way, faith mattered to them, whatever that faith was. That was a really key, it was a really helpful way to say, somebody would say, well, what about, Greta Thunberg, or somebody who's doing incredible stuff for climate? And I would say, oh yeah, she's of course doing amazing things. I can't see that faith is an important motivation for her. So that was, there's lots of books about incredible women or incredible scientists or things like that. But what I haven't seen much of is an anthology of people of faith, whose stories I actually wanted to share with my children. And so that was a key distinction, is faith matters to them, for whatever that faith happened to be. And then the other was they did something in their world to bring about more love, more justice, kindness, compassion. And that could be a small sphere or a large sphere. So those are really the distinctions. And I had so many more names that people suggested that I could possibly ever write about. And there's already, volume 2 is one day going to happen. And I will definitely, under volume 2, try to have fewer Christians. I do think because, my background is thoroughly from that tradition. It was where I was most comfortable beginning from. And I'll probably try to flip that ratio next time, where there are, definitely Christians represented, but it's a wider representation of other faiths as well. But some of the other faith profiles are some of my favorites. People like Madia Lynn, whose portrait I'm also completely in love with. I just love the energy of that one. Madia was an Iranian transgender Muslim activist who really helped define transgender rights in Iran, which surprisingly is still quite progressive for the region. And then I learned so much writing about people, like you mentioned Reverend Gaffney. I'll show folks Reverend Gaffney's portrait, a womanist scholar, and trying to write definitions for things like womanism, or Gustavo Gutierrez is one of my other favorites. And liberation theology for kids. Definitions like that actually ended up being harder probably than writing most of the profiles. And I was able to interview almost all of the living people. A few people like Thich Nhat Hanh, who was living when I wrote the book, were, not somebody who I could access and who was not in a place actually to be giving interviews anymore. But otherwise, the living people, other than just a handful, I was really privileged to interview, and that was terrifying in a few occasions, but really, really meaningful. I've always loved On Being, or before that, the Speaking of Faith, Krista Tippett's job. And I've always thought that would be one of the best jobs in the world. And interviewing people for this book was a little bit like that. I actually got to interview Rachel Held Evans very shortly before her death, about 3 days before her trip that started her illness. So it was really meaningful and difficult to rewrite that profile with some past tense verbs and things instead. But the living people were definitely much, much trickier to write about. And I did run the profiles by all of them to make sure that I didn't misrepresent something. And of course, the people who were writers, somebody like Valerie Kaur, had a few other things they wanted written about, versus other people were just like, oh, wonderful, this is great. Or like most of the time it was just a correction in my math. I honestly, I think every single time I tried to calculate like a story that they told me to an age or a date, I somehow managed to get that wrong. But yeah, it was a really good experience. It was very life-giving to see the world through their walk, through their witness. Bonnie, I just stopped being able to hear you. I don't know if that's true for anybody else.
I think you're muted, Bonnie.
I was, and now I'm not. So sorry about that. Sharon, do you want to ask a question next?
Yes. Well, first of all, your book is very well loved in our home. It's such a gorgeous book. And I was super curious about the art side of it. And there's so much diversity represented in the art itself, whether it's the style of art and the artists themselves. I was just curious what that process was like. How did you find the artists? What kind of parameters did you give them? Was it just, kind of open-ended, like, make a portrait of this person, or did you let them choose which one they wanted to do? I would just love to hear about how that went, and also, like, how long was this process of creating the book, the production?
Oh, so much longer than I would have anticipated. As anybody who's done a project like this can attest. Yes, so I was really inspired by Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, which was a project that I loved the look of it and the feel of it. And it was one of those things where I thought, well, I just don't have anything that looks this beautiful that I want to sit down and read with my children. And the idea sort of came to me, and it's a really, 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 really tricky process to work with many artists on a project. Most publishers will never consider that, because it's just, everybody has a different medium. They have different ways of working. They have different ideas of deadlines and how serious those are, and different ways they like to be paid, and international, not what kind of bank account are you sending to? All of that was a lot to figure out. And I ended up having to essentially be the art director first and then the writer. I did write a few of the profiles just in the beginning to see if it was something that I could do. I hadn't written this is a middle grades targeted book, and I hadn't written for that age group before. And so I did a few just to see if it felt like something that I could do. I actually think it's way harder to write for that age group than it is for adults. You find you have to be far more concrete and not just use other ambiguous words to define something. And then I really just had to do the art management side of it first, because it was an entirely different energy required. And I really have not been somebody who has ever done, I'm not an artist myself. I've never done art direction. I didn't even know some of the terminology. It took like a little bit of educating myself, mainly through mistakes. Signing a contract that I thought I meant one thing and it turned out it meant another, or things like that. But yeah, for example, the Florence Nightingale portrait is a lino print. So it's like done in reverse. There's definitely some digital art, like Reverend Jackie Lewis. This is actually my youngest daughter's favorite stayed in the entire book, and it has stayed that way for 3 years now. This portrait for Caitlin Curtis is really meaningful to me because she's Potawatomi, and the artist is also, and it was really meaningful to, and she actually recently posted something on social media with this portrait and saying it was the first time another Native woman had ever depicted her and how meaningful that was for her. And so that was just a really meaningful thing. I tried to match up artists who I thought would identify with the subject in some way. It wasn't always 100% possible, but it was really important to me for to do that as much as possible. Thich Nhat Hanh is an embroidered portrait. Just incredible to imagine.
Incredible. I love that.
I've done a teensy bit of embroidery since I'm working on this. I just cannot fathom doing a portrait of that level. There's watercolor as well. I'm trying to think of a few others, but yeah, it was an entire process. Oh, these like Harriet Tubman is done on like wood. This is like a wooden paint, like painting on a piece of wood, sort of iconography style, or modern iconography style, I should say. And then there's also, oh yeah, Bayard Rustin is a screen print. Brian Kyle from PUC did Mr. Rogers, actually, which is also a screen print. Mr. Rogers, where'd you go? Here we go. I have to move the opposite way that I think on Zoom. Yeah, so watching the art come to life was probably one of my favorite parts of this process. I had never ever done anything like that before, and it's just magical. Jennifer Knapp is actually Sharpie on cardboard. This is an artist that does a lot of protest art. So she likes to have her work be super accessible, like anybody could be in the street making something like this. Yeah, so it was really, really rewarding doing that, and also just a complete logistical nightmare. And but I'll know a little bit more next time, and also that it just takes a great deal longer than you anticipate. But it also made it an expensive project. Trying to pay artists a fair price for original art adds up, but incredibly meaningful to do so as well. I feel like it's a combination art book and children's book, which is not that frequent of a combo. So it was always a difficult thing to describe, what shelf does it live on in a bookstore?
Yes. And your cover artist for this book, who is also the artist for your next book, I am such a fan of her art. I follow her on social media and admire her work so much. Just gorgeous work. Yes, Jillian Gamble. Although she's changing her professional last name, I need to learn how to pronounce it. She's Scottish. Yeah, same. She's Scottish, and it's a Scottish word. It means of the sea, I think. Anyway, I think so. Yeah. Yes, for Dear Mama God, she is still using Gamble. So Jillian Gamble. Yeah, she also did Alice Paul, Rachel Held Evans, and Mary Oliver's portrait in Holy Troublemakers, as well as the cover. Yeah, so I feel like I know artists now in a way I absolutely never did before, and I have so much respect. But it really brings something to life in a whole other way. Wonderful.
That's a really important part of the story. So thank you. Nancy.
Yeah, so I have a couple questions, and I don't think the answers are going to need to be quite as long as on Sharon's question about all of the art. One of them is, I used to teach lit for children, and there are so many children's books, and I'm talking about good children's books, wonderful children's books, more and more every year, that one person can't even look at them all, right? So why did you decide that we needed another book in the world? And this was it.
Have you read Uncle Arthur books recently? It came strongly out of my desire to have something that I wanted to read with my children that had something to do with faith that I felt good about sharing with them. And the truth is that when you start thinking about faith-based books for children, they generally all fall into the could be in a Lifeway Christian bookstore, although I think most of those are out of business now, but at the time of those kind of books. And if you start caring, which because of the Seventh-day Adventist film and that whole journey, if you start caring about something that tells the stories also of LGBTQ people of faith, if you don't want sort of just a whitewashed patriotic view of Christianity, my eldest daughter started caring. I mean, she went along with me caring as well, but she really started to notice that everything was he for God. And if you start caring about those kinds of things, it's almost impossible to find more than a handful of children's books that have anything to do with faith that are going to also connect with those values. So it was really wanting to find stories of people of faith who had values that I wanted to share with my kids.
So that intersection of book, so the mainstream publishers don't do much with faith.
Correct.
They stay away from that.
Yeah, they don't know what to do. They're scared of it, so they just ignore it.
Exactly. And then the faith-based publishers tended to be very conservative and very, what you call whitewashed. So, right. So despite the fact there's so many books, you actually found a desert, right?
Yes, shockingly.
Yeah.
It wasn't a food desert, it was a book desert, yes.
Yeah, and you filled it with this beautiful book. My other question is, I don't know, it might be silly or wrongheaded. I wanted to ask you about someone that I think you originally thought to put in the book and then didn't. Because I was looking at old videos where you were just getting the project going, and I'm sure I saw Lady Godiva.
Yes.
And I have to know why you originally wanted to include her. I obviously have not kept up on my Lady Godiva history. So I kind of was curious about that.
Well, there tends to be some things that are a great idea, but when you think of the portrait in a children's book, it could probably still be done cleverly. There's a few that didn't work out.
Behind the horse.
Yes, there's a few that didn't work out. You know, the story of her is the reason she did this possibly apocryphal horse ride naked was to pressure her husband into not, you know, taxing their tenants into, you know, extreme poverty and hunger. And it was sort of like a challenge he laid down, and she was like, fine, I accept. And actually the Peeping Tom story comes out of there too, that everybody turned their heads out of respect, like nobody actually watched except for one Tom, the Peeping Tom. That's, I mean, these are all stories that are quite legendary at this point. It's hard to always pinpoint that, but yes, she was somebody who I still do admire, but I never did quite find the right artist for that story to work out. There's a few like that, and there's a few things that I didn't include in this volume just because the profiles ended up being longer. You know, something like Rebel Girls, the profiles are extremely short, and these profiles in general have a little bit more of a chapter feel to them.
Well, she has my vote for volume 2.
Okay.
Well, and if you do decide to include it, I would recommend Nancy's brother as the artist, because he's very good. He did a couple covers for us that started out a little on the naked side, and we worked with them, and you know, we came up with something that worked. And so and he loves historical figures, so John is who you need for.
Okay,
Okay, good.
that portrait. And I'm sure all of us have nominations of people for your next book. I've got two.
It's really fun, actually, that part. People still write in with suggestions, and I love getting those suggestions.
Yeah. Alex, do you have suggestions, or where do you want to take this conversation?
I have high praise first. I really love reading this book. I'm not a scholar of, children's or YA literature like Nancy, but I found myself really appreciating learning more about people that I had kind of heard, their names, or that they were important in the struggle. And so I found this really fun, and I'm already thinking about, other people's kids that I can buy this book for. So
Good.
thanks for creating it. And I'll get to my question here in a second, which will have to do with the importance of stories in film and writing a book, two media that you've excelled at. But I want to start out by mentioning that you were part of a book club almost 20 years ago that I was graciously invited to. Sharon was a part of that as well. And it's really just fun to think back on, us gathering and reading books together, and the ways those sort of small gestures of community matter over time. So it's just a call for books and gathering and conversations, I guess. So back then you weren't a filmmaker at the level that you've attained, and a book author as well. So I'm kind of curious, because Seventh-day Adventist gets referenced over and over again in my world by folks as this really important moment in the Adventist conversation about social justice. And since then, obviously, you've done this book, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the way that you have thought about story as a way of impacting people of faith. Specifically, we have theologians who try to make an impact. We have pastors who use a form, a homily, to make an impact. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the way that story specifically has been a tool for you, how you think about it. I'm really interested in some specifics there. I know I'm putting you on the spot, but why have you chosen this way of raising people's consciousness?
Well, in many ways, I should make sure I say that I have not been doing any of this work alone. The reason I can talk to you right now without lots of noise in the background is that my spouse and creative partner, Stephen Heyer, has them elsewhere. And he and I have been working together actually since PUC days. We worked on the newspaper together when he was an editor. And he used to be so tired publication days that I would be the one driving to Santa Rosa because he was too tired. So I skipped a lot of Linda Gill's classes on Friday mornings. My lit theory is missing 20% of its knowledge. So he likes to say that, and this is, I don't know if he's certainly not the originator of this idea, but he says it in a way that I actually quote in the introduction to Holy Troublemakers: "We are made of stories and stardust." And I really do think that's how humans work. We work through story. I still have, like, every good sermon I've ever remembered is because it had a good story in there. Jesus taught through stories. And I think if you remember back in the day, in 2008, Alex, you and I and a few others were part of Adventists Against Prop 8, an effort to try to help Adventists vote no on Prop 8, which meant not enshrining discrimination against same-sex couples into the California Constitution on the bounds of religious liberty, where Adventists have often been a little bit surprising in what they have stuck up for on the grounds that people have, the right to believe and worship as they do and not be coerced. So we were working on that and did a few little, PSAs. And I still remember David Larson saying, vote no on 8 for Jesus' sake. Stories and rhymes. Also, our brains remember them. And, Prop 8 passed, and it was really, really unsettling and surprising. And it was all kinds of things, especially in San Francisco where we lived at the time. And we were going to church in a sort of unofficial gathering that was mainly what I call refugees from Adventism, that included a fair number of LGBT Adventists. And I remember Lily was born, my eldest, right about that time. And a few weeks later, we were doing sort of a late night phone call with the 6 of us who'd been involved with that, saying like, wow, what happened? What can we do? Like, that was really disappointing. And I remember Stephen, my spouse, saying, hearts and minds are only changed through story. And you have to get to know people to care about them. And if you can't have a personal relationship with somebody in your life, a film or a book or something is, not the same, of course, but it's certainly an avenue to get to know people in a different way. So that was really the genesis of what became the Seventh Gay Adventist film and related projects, was really that conversation. So I have to really credit my spouse with with a lot of that, but I've just leaned into that watching my own children and how much, we are creatures of story. It's how every culture has always shared its values. Even now we're looking at myth making on like grand political scales and seeing like how dang effective it is, scarily effective. And we need story. And I myself have turned to story a lot when I don't know quite what to do. I named my children after characters in stories that give me hope. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Harry Potter, which was about ultimately love being the most powerful force in the universe, which I have needed to believe in order to even want to bring children into this world. And so I myself find solace in stories and purpose and hope. I just finished reading The Lord of the Rings through the pandemic with a small group. We met on our porch, and a local professor he's a religion teacher and a big fan of Tolkien came, and a weekly fellowship with the fellowship really got us through the really difficult parts of COVID. And I really treasure that time. So the next book being Dear Mama God, it's one of those things where my children hear me speak about God as a mother and use feminine metaphors and pronouns. And we actually go to a church now that frequently does too. But having a book really, really helps it seem like I'm not crazy. And I think it'll help other people who want to introduce that into their home feel like, well, here's where we can go. Like stories make something manifest in a way, especially stories in book form can do that in a really powerful way. So
I'm going to interrupt quickly. I'm thinking about Christmas. How soon is Dear Mama God coming out?
Yeah, I sure wish. We were really hoping it should be at the press right now. And there's been 3 different COVID delays this year so it's going to press now early next year. It will be out for Mother's Day though. Earth Day and Mother's Day is now our new window. So there will be a Kickstarter actually coming soon for that also. It doesn't need to be quite as big a one. For Holy Troublemakers was a very ambitious project. I've learned that picture books, while seemingly simpler, are actually incredibly difficult too. So
I'll just interrupt and say, make sure that I'm aware of the publication time so that we can make a big deal about it on Spectrum.
One of my first jobs was book editor on Spectrum back in the day when websites were a new thing.
Right. And you've also recorded at Spectrum conferences the stories of people who attended. We all have a story.
Mm-hmm.
Carmen, we all have questions also.
Well, I've loved this time and hearing all the different angles of how this was made. And I wanted to just find out, like, in a way, Daneen, it's like it's kind of like Daneen as theologian too. I mean, like you're telling stories, but I mean, in the glossary, you're explaining some theological concepts. And I was just kind of wondering, do you have a sense about the impact of this book? We're saying we're all kind of siloed now and stuck in our tracks. And do you have a sense that it has reached out of the track to anyone who, perhaps through these stories would have a mind change? Or do you have a sense that this book is serving more as, support and nourishment for people who, would automatically be sympathetic? Like you were saying, you felt a need, and as for your own children, do you have any sense about reaching into spaces that perhaps could be more difficult? Or I'm just wondering what sort of feedback you've gotten.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gone
So
out.
that's a huge question, and it was sort of a key thing. So with Seventh-day Adventists, the documentary, and then there was Enough Room at the Table, and then the Outspoken short series, those efforts were very much done as bridge building efforts, very much wanting to tell stories with a group of people who were often talked about in churches, especially Adventist churches, but not a whole lot of actual conversation. So, and especially the discussions, I think we led personally about 80 screenings and discussions of Seventh-day Adventists. And that effort was really, really meaningful. I would never change it. And it almost broke me. It was so exhausting. It was physically challenging just to be on the road. And, for some reason, we didn't think of doing this project before children. So doing it with a kid, it was logistically challenging. But, I do think a lot of it was our exploration of if the Adventist church was going to be where we were going to raise said child. And now she has a younger sister too. So that was sort of our personal identity piece being explored through that film. And yeah, I really decided with Holy Troublemakers and Unconventional Saints that this was more of a nourishment project for me and for parents like me. It came right after the 2016 election. So I don't think that's a surprise at all that there was, and I think, especially white evangelicalism in 2016, after that election, we suddenly saw and not everybody, many people have their eyes opened already, but for a lot of people, it's been an awakening of just how embedded some really, really difficult things are, with white evangelicalism in America and what it has done and is doing right now still. And so for me, this book came out of the aftermath of that and trying to figure out, well, what can I do that feels nourishing? And I don't want my children to have that kind of Christianity, but I do want to show them people who have worked for love and justice, and often that has been at great, expense, personal expense. So, yeah, I feel like this was a soul-saving project for me, and I don't think it has reached. Like it wasn't intended to reach conservative parents, really. It was meant to more reach parents like me, and I even started an entirely new mailing list, like email newsletter list and stuff, because I just knew the crossover wasn't going to be quite as strong as our bridge building efforts previously had been. So I do get stories from people a lot saying how much they love some of the themes that come out in these profiles of something they wanted to talk about with their children. But this gave them a way and a person and a story to hook onto. So that has been rewarding. But no, it wasn't a bridge building effort like the others. And we'll see if I ever get the energy for that kind of effort again.
Yeah, thank you. It is hard work, and we appreciate all your creativity. It's fun to be kind of on the edges, to be together in a group, even though we're not together physically, just to know that there's a core group of people that appreciate you, Daneen. So, yeah.
Well, and stories of faith I think, are hard to find good stories of faith in literature in general. Authors have a hard time telling stories of faith, I think. So,
Well, we're
um,
coming up on All Saints Day, and this time of year when we do remember the ancestors in the faith, the cloud of witnesses. This is not as big a thing in the Adventist world as it is elsewhere. And I go to a church now that does follow a liturgical calendar, and I've come to greatly appreciate actually the wisdom behind that cycle. And, you know, this is the time of year where we're remembering the ancestors in different ways. And I think the ancestors of the faith give us courage. You know, they have been through you know, when I think that life is difficult, I think of Bayard Rustin, and I'm like, you know what, I'm doing just fine today, actually. And he still kept showing up. So, and sometimes I need to think of Mary Oliver, because sometimes the point is to go hug a big black walnut tree.
Yeah. Well, it's time for us to include some of the other people on line with us. If you have a question, please raise your hand. And Charlotte, what is your question? You need to unmute yourself, Charlotte.
It's a comment and it will be brief. I read the 19th century Victorian authors, and primarily you see people of faith in rather negative ways. Dickens, for example, in his Bleak House, there's Mrs. Jellyby who let her children go naked while she took care of the heathen in Africa, and Mrs. Pardiggle, who took her children's allowance and made them put it to a charitable purpose. And the children, of course, hated the church and charity and so forth. And the Reverend Chad Band, who in great rolling orotund sentences, it's a perfect book. You should all read that book, and then read Daneen's book as an antidote.
My favorite character of faith is in Dennis Johnson's Tree of Smoke. And he's telling the story of the Vietnam War, and there's an Adventist nurse in the story that to me is the hero of the story. But those kind of characters are few and far between, that's for sure. So thank you very much for helping us find more characters to or saints to love and cherish. So
some of them are people we know, but we didn't know they had a faith background, like Florence Nightingale comes to mind as somebody who we know for her nursing and all of that pioneering, but she was also actually an incredible mathematician who sort of invented modern statistics in the way that we think of them now, at least parts of it. And she was a profound thinker on matters of faith and wrote like just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages, and was never published. It was all to friends, but she was what we would probably consider pretty radical. She had a pretty universalist perspective, and yeah, I loved learning that about her.
research is fun, huh? Do we have any other questions from our panel? Are there other, we've gone through a lot of process and art discussion. We haven't done as much with the individual characters. Was there a particular story that spoke to you as you went through the book? Sharon?
Well, immediately for me personally, I will have to go to Mary Oliver, who is sort of a central figure for me in my creative life and also just spiritually. And, you know, the portrait that Jillian made of Mary Oliver is just breathtaking. And it was wonderful just to see her included in this collection. But I just as a side note, I will say, it was so refreshing and encouraging to see so many LGBTQ saints included in this collection, because I don't think anywhere in children's literature is there a book in which LGBTQ individuals are equated with holiness or saintlyhood. And it's so important. I mean, it's not just for LGBTQ youth themselves, but anyone to sort of have that bridged. And so that in our minds, like, oh, it probably has never occurred to a lot of people that a person who is LGBTQ could also be a saint. Like, it's just not something that we grow up with typically in a faith community. And so I think, it's groundbreaking, it's important, and it's so appreciated. So I just wanted to mention that.
I totally agree. We have, and in fact, I remember a report came out not that long ago from GLAAD about the media narrative is either or, and you're either a person of faith or you're LGBTQ. And of course, they often try to pit those two against each other. And, there's a fair bit of that out there. But it turned out that statistically, as the rates of religious affiliation have been declining in the hetero population, they've actually gone up in the LGBTQ community, which is not a story we hear nearly enough about. So yes, I think especially because of our work with Seventh-day Adventists and my own learning that, LGBTQ Adventists are by and large much more committed people of faith than the average Adventist or myself, that it was really important to tell those stories.
Alex?
Yeah, we've got about 10 or so people on Facebook watching as well. And Sherilyn Kristen Clow, hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. She says, love all your work, Daneen. So sending you that comment there. And then I've got a question for you, just because I'm curious what, is there an interesting anecdote, some feedback that you've gotten from some readers that I'm just, I'm kind of curious what what people say about your work to you after they've read it outside of this circle.
Actually, it's pretty similar. I would say it's all the same. And I actually love hearing from readers, because this book came out right before COVID. So we did one book event in Asheville, and that was it. Otherwise, COVID happened very, very much in alignment with this book coming out. So I have had very little chance to interact live with readers. So I love hearing from people. I remember hearing from a rabbi, actually, who said she loves the book because the whole intergenerations of their family really like it. And so they've been using it as a family devotional. And they have one of their grandkids is non-binary, and the fact that LGBTQ stories were told, and there's actually a non-binary person in the book as well, was just something that they all really leaned into. So I've actually loved hearing from people who are using it as a bit of a devotional, which is not how I had thought of it, but it turns out that's the way a fair number of people are using it, probably because it's short enough chapters.
Very good. Carmen, you have a favorite character?
Well, I like the little segment of Rachel Held Evans. I've heard her speak in person, and I liked that you told the conversation, where her father said, "Rachel, I don't know." She asked him a hard question, and here he was so knowledgeable and a man of God, and he didn't know, and that kind of opened the way for her. And I just think that's an important story to tell children, because we like to think of ourselves as founts of resource and information. And I just think that little bit of, I don't know. That was powerful. As far as some of the favorite quotes that I liked in the book was in the chapter about Valerie Kaur. Is that how you pronounce it?
Valerie Kaur, yes.
Okay. Yes, well, I loved her father, Papa G. Well, he said 190 Sikh, a Sikh family. He said, you must wonder about others even when they refuse to wonder about you. You must choose to love them anyway and fight for them when they are in harm's way. That's what it means to be a warrior. Yeah,
I turn to her all the time. If anybody,
Yes.
she's a really she teaches a lot on these topics still. She has a book called See No Stranger. I've got it sitting right here. That I highly recommend.
Okay.
And one of the things that she teaches that I return to all the time is you don't, and she's really talking to like when people are really upset for yeah, there was one of the many things that happened during the Trump administration that was upsetting. And she said, you don't have, like, love does not require warm feelings, you know, about somebody who's oppressing. It's just being curious about them, like holding their humanity, even when they're not holding it for themselves. And I think that really is the whole point of nonviolence. That was Bayard Rustin's point too, in that people are never the enemy.
Yeah.
You know, that double victory that Dr. King would talk about is that those doing the oppressing will also realize the oppressive system that they are caught up in and enforcing, and will be saved, for lack of a better word, from that as well. So I think in the way that our culture has gotten so divisive, that remembering that people aren't the enemy. You know, there's harmful ideologies and ways of being, but people are not. And Valerie, and really Sikhs in general, are people I think we should be learning a lot from.
Alex, do you have a favorite quote that you want to read?
I do, yes. I enjoyed your focus on Reverend Jackie Lewis, who I got to spend a week with in New York on during a class on arts and religion in the city. So I was amazed by her. She felt like this deeply self-aware presence and was incredibly dynamic. And I've enjoyed, yeah, there she is, enjoyed going to her church, their middle church.
And you know, it burned down.
I know, tragedy.
So, yes, they're working on
Yes.
rebuilding, but yeah.
And actually, I don't know the name of this. Sorry, this is what's the former PUC? Yeah, Jeremy Price, former PUC student.
Jeremy is who introduced us to Middle Church and Reverend Jackie. We were out in New York for a screening of Seventh-day Adventists, and Jeremy was playing the organ at this church, and we went, and it was the most joyful, incredible service we had ever been to. And I thought, I want a faith like that. Yeah,
incredible. It's like something I look forward to doing when I'm there in New York. So I'll just read, because I thought the way that she thought about communion is, or how she was introduced to communion was just beautiful. So I'll just read. Little Jackie didn't understand much of what the pastor was saying, but as she was passed a small bite of bread, her mother whispered in her ear, "This bread means God will always love you." She ate the bread. Next, she removed a small glass from a golden tray with red velvet in between the small cup holders. This time, her mother whispered in her ear, "God will never leave you." I just find that so beautiful in thinking about this ritual and making, you know, just a reminder that we can, you know, maybe find profound theology in very simple sentences about what faith means. So thank you.
Daneen, I found the collection of saints really fascinating, from your friends like Leslie Foster, you know, to Florence Nightingale. And I think we all put together our own list of saints, the people who are saints to us. I wonder if you have any advice on how we find saints.
I was looking for Leslie's portrait here really fast because you
I
mentioned
thought
him.
his portrait was really interesting because
Gorgeous.
what you were talking about it with Leslie was a very common piece of time. He's sitting in waiting to see whether he is chosen as a juror at court. And he's just
Mhm.
having to sit there. And the lessons that he gets out of just waiting,
Mhm.
you capture very nicely. And so capturing small moments of friends as well as significant movements in history, you've really spanned quite a spectrum there.
I think it was important for me to include, right, somebody like Leslie Foster that isn't going to be in a like canon of important. Not yet. Leslie though is still young and working, so wait and see. Because what I want kids to take away is that we all can be holy troublemakers and unconventional saints. You don't have to be recognized necessarily in, the lists of important people somewhere, which, somebody like a Florence Nightingale it is. And I love that. And actually Leslie's one of those chapters that has a lot of incredible information in there about how we create culture, as well as Leslie introduced me to Mother God, spelled Godde, which is something I've now come across a lot more in my research for the Dear Mama God book. And I love that. It's a visual way to jar yourself because God, as a gender neutral term, lands in our bodies as male still after so many, sorry, that's my dog in the background. We have thousands of years of all the liturgy, art, and teachings dictating that response. And so Godde is just a lovely visual reminder when you're even writing or reading something. Oh, right, this isn't the Sistine Chapel bearded white guy on the clouds I'm thinking of here. So I really love Leslie's chapter and all of the lessons in there, including how to be bored and how creativity comes from that, which is really something we need even more for now.
Could I say
Well,
something quickly
Mhm.
before we?
please.
I'm the mother of two white sons, right? And I think this world has gotten very, very different for them, right? Growing up. And so I'm appreciating Mr. Rogers because his whole persona is, I am not a troublemaker, right? I am very quiet and calm, and I move slowly, and I talk gently to little children. And yet that's how he made trouble, right?
Right.
And so I appreciate that he's a wonderful role model for, white men can be saints too, and quiet people can be troublemakers. And it was a nice choice anyway. I wanted to put in.
I think that's super important because, of course, the first thing that comes to mind when you think of holy trouble and holy troublemaking is, a protest or something big and bold. And of course, those are sometimes things that we need. Oh, I hear a hurricane coming in. Hey, babe, we're still talking. One second. Yeah. Almost done. This is my youngest. This is Lucy. Right, but it's just as important that the quiet contemplative ways that we stand up against the status quo matter too. And we are going to need white hetero men to do good things. I love his point. He says, this is Mr. Rogers. One second, Vicky.
Hey Lou,
I believe
1 second, so we can join later.
we're still recording. There you go. This is what life is normally like here. If you wonder why volume 2 isn't out yet.
You need to go out.
He says, I believe appreciate. You wonder what moms' lives during the pandemic was like. with kids home all the time on screen. I believe appreciation is a holy thing. That when we look for what's best in a person we happen to be with at that moment, we're doing what God does all the time. So in loving and appreciating our neighbor, we're participating in something sacred. And I love it because it's so simple and it's so beautiful and yet so profound.
That's a wonderful quote to close our conversation. Unfortunately, since we've passed the 3 o'clock hour, it's been tons of fun, and we thank you, Daneen, for the book and for spending time with us. And we're looking forward to those prayers to Dear Mama God next year. Spectrum Book Club is going to take a holiday break, and we'll be back in some form or other, I think, after the first of the year. Is that right, Carmen and Alex?
Yes,
but-
watch for details. We'll be back.
Okay.
In the spring.
Thank you to Daneen, to Sharon, to Nancy, and all of you for being with us. I'd like to leave you with a quote from the beginning of the book, since we talked about this group as being troublemakers and unconventional saints. To all of you, troublemakers and unconventional saints, may you find inspiration to do the right thing when it's the hard thing. Stand up for those who are standing alone, work together in the common good, have courage when the odds are against you, be brave, cause a little trouble when necessary, and love with your whole hearts like the saints who have gone before. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you all so much.